Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Gohan eats a devil fruit that amplifies ki? Subscribe if you enjoy the video. And also check the description. So let's begin the story. The first thing Gohan noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of his study at home, where he could lose himself in quantum physics textbooks while Videl graded papers at the kitchen table. Not the companionable stillness of flying high above the clouds, where the world below became abstract and distant. This was something else entirely. A silence that felt wrong, like the absence of a sound he hadn't realized he'd been listening for his entire life. He opened his eyes to unfamiliar stars. The realization came slowly, filtering through the haze of pain that wrapped around his ribs and the pounding in his skull. These constellations were wrong. The familiar patterns he'd memorized as a child, Orion's belt, the Big Dipper, the North Star his mother had taught him to find when he was 5 years old, none of them existed in this sky. Instead, foreign arrangements of light stared down at him with the indifference of witnesses to something they couldn't quite comprehend. Gohan pushed himself upright, sand grinding beneath his palms. The beach stretched in both directions, silvered by moonlight, and the ocean whispered against the shore with a rhythm that felt subtly off. Even the waves moved differently here, he realized with growing unease. The gravity was lighter, not dramatically so, but enough that his body registered the difference in 1,000 small ways. Each breath came too easily. His hair fell against his forehead with less weight than it should have. Where am I? The last thing he remembered was the dimensional tear opening in front of him during patrol. He'd been flying over West City, keeping an eye out for the usual threats. Bank robberies, car accidents, the occasional meteor that needed redirecting, when reality had simply cracked. Like glass under pressure, the air in front of him had split along invisible fault lines, and beyond it he'd glimpsed something impossible. An ocean that stretched forever, islands floating in defiance of physics, and a sky that burned with colors that had no names. He tried to stop. Had thrown himself backward, ki flaring in instinctive defense. But the tear had pulled at him with inexorable hunger, and for one terrifying moment he'd felt his atoms begin to separate, spread across the dimensional barrier like paint smeared across canvas. Then darkness had swallowed him whole, and he'd fallen through spaces between spaces, through the gaps in reality where the rules that governed existence became negotiable. Now he was here. Wherever here was, Gohan rose to his feet, testing his balance against the lighter gravity. His GI was torn, the purple fabric shredded across his chest where something, the dimensional crossing itself, perhaps, had raked across him with invisible claws. Blood had dried in dark streaks across his skin, but beneath it he could feel the wounds already closing. His Saiyan healing factor was working, at least. That was something. He reached inward, searching for his ki, and felt it respond, but strangely, like an echo arriving a fraction of a second too late. The energy that had always been as natural as breathing now felt muted, as though he were trying to sense it through water. He raised one hand and attempted to form a small ki blast, the kind of thing he could do without thought, and watched as the sphere of energy flickered weakly before dissipating into nothing. What the hell? The words came out rough, his throat raw from salt and screaming he couldn't remember. He tried again, putting more focus into it. This time the ki responded better, gathering in his palm with familiar warmth. But maintaining it required concentration he'd never needed before, and when he released it, aiming for a piece of driftwood 50 meters down the beach, the blast went wide by almost 10 degrees, splashing harmlessly into the surf. Gohan stared at his hand, fingers trembling. In his world, his ki control was perfect. Years of training with Piccolo, with his father, with Master Roshi and Whis had honed his ability to manipulate energy until it was as precise as a surgeon's scalpel. Now he couldn't hit a stationary target at close range. The implication settled over him like a shroud. Whatever this place was, it operated under different rules. The laws of physics, or metaphysics, or whatever governed ki manipulation, weren't quite the same here. He was, in the most fundamental sense, no longer in his own universe. Mom. Videl. Pan. The thought of his family hit him like a physical blow. His daughter would be waking up soon, expecting him to make her breakfast before school. Videl would notice his absence immediately, would probably try his cell phone first before checking with Bulma, who would run every scanner and detector she had. And his mother, God, his mother would blame herself somehow, would convince herself she should have made him stay home more often, should have kept him safe the way she tried to when he was a child. They would search for him. Would probably keep searching long after hope became irrational, and he had no way to tell them he was alive. No way to even begin looking for a path home when he didn't understand where he'd ended up. Gohan forced himself to breathe, to push the panic down into the place where he kept all the other fears he couldn't afford to examine too closely. Falling apart wouldn't help anyone. He needed information, needed to understand this world well enough to survive it, and hopefully well enough to find a way back. The village lights he could see flickering in the distance seemed like the logical place to start. The coastal settlement was small. Maybe 200 buildings clustered around a natural harbor where fishing boats bobbed in the pre-dawn darkness. Gohan approached cautiously, keeping to the shadows, watching the few people who moved through the streets with the practiced wariness of someone who'd spent too much of his childhood fighting enemies who looked human but decidedly weren't. The architecture was wrong in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The buildings were made of wood and stone, but their construction suggested a technology level that didn't quite match. Some structures had glass windows, expensive, precision-crafted glass, while others made do with wooden shutters. Electric lights hung from some storefronts, but most relied on oil lamps or torches. It was as if someone had jumbled together different eras of development, and hoped they'd sort themselves out. And the people? God, the people were strange. A man walked past wearing what looked like a pirate costume, not for any party or festival that Gohan could see, but as ordinary clothing. A woman strolled by with blue hair that seemed natural rather than dyed, her proportions subtly exaggerated in a way that reminded him uncomfortably of his mother's old anime magazines. A child ran past with a pet that looked like a cross between a cat and a seal, chittering in a language that definitely wasn't any animal sound Gohan had ever heard. He tried to read the signs, and realized with sinking dread that he could. The written language was completely foreign, characters that bore no resemblance to any alphabet or ideogram he'd studied, yet somehow his mind translated them effortlessly. A gift from the dimensional crossing? Some kind of automatic translation that came with being pulled between worlds? He had no idea, but filed it away as another mystery to unravel later. His stomach chose that moment to remind him that he hadn't eaten in what felt like days. The hunger was sudden and overwhelming, hitting him with the particular intensity that only came from Saiyan metabolism pushed too far. His vision swam slightly, black spots dancing at the edges, and he stumbled against the wall to keep from falling. Need food. Need it now. The fruit stand was small, tucked between a blacksmith's shop and what looked like a tavern. The vendor was an old woman with kind eyes, arranging her wares in the pre-dawn light. Apples and oranges and things Gohan didn't recognize but which looked close enough to be safe. Among them, gleaming with an almost luminescent quality, was something that resembled a mango. Its skin was golden, swirled with patterns that seemed to pulse faintly in the half-light, and just looking at it made Gohan's mouth water. He reached for it without thinking, hunger overriding caution, and his fingers had closed around it before the vendor could do more than gasp. Boy, no! But Gohan had already bitten into it, teeth tearing through the flesh, and the taste that flooded his mouth was indescribably wrong. Not spoiled, not poisonous, but fundamentally incorrect in a way that made every instinct scream for him to spit it out. It tasted like meat that had been left in the sun mixed with seawater, and something bitter that burned all the way down his throat. His gag reflex kicked in immediately, but he'd already swallowed, the fruit dissolving on his tongue like it was eager to be consumed. The change was instantaneous. His ki, already strange and muted in this world, suddenly exploded within him. It felt like someone had taken the volume dial on his internal energy and cranked it to 11, then kept turning. Power flooded through his meridians with such force that his knees buckled, and he hit the ground gasping as waves of energy crashed through him like a storm that couldn't find an outlet. Oh no, the vendor whispered, her kind eyes now wide with horror. Oh no, child, what have you done? Gohan tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but his body was too busy trying to contain the tsunami of ki that threatened to tear him apart from the inside. He could feel it amplifying, multiplying, feeding on itself in a loop that had no natural endpoint. It was his energy, unmistakably his, but more, louder, brighter, more violent than anything he'd ever experienced, even during his transformations. And beneath it all, spreading through his cells like ink through water, was something else. A fundamental change in the structure of his being, rewriting rules he hadn't known could be changed. He felt his connection to the ocean, to all water, to the very concept of the sea itself, twist into something awful. The moisture in the air that had always been ambient background noise suddenly felt like it was pressing against him, draining something vital from his core. "You ate a devil fruit," the vendor said, her voice trembling with something between pity and fear. "The Kenki no Mi, if I'm reading the patterns right. It amplifies fighting spirit, battle aura, whatever you want to call the life force warriors carry. But the cost." She looked at him with those kind, sad eyes. "You'll never swim again, boy. The sea will hate you now, reject you. Even standing in water will sap your strength until you drown in an inch-deep puddle." Gohan managed to focus on her face, the world swimming around him as his body struggled to adapt to the changes. "Devil fruit? Mystical fruits that grant powers," she explained, already reaching for the pile of coins he'd noticed sitting on her stand. "Payment for the cursed thing he just consumed," he realized dimly. "But they curse you in return. The sea becomes your enemy. Water will drain you faster than bleeding out." She pressed the coins into his hand with gentle firmness. "I'm sorry, child. I should have warned you faster. Should have marked it better. I just kept it because it was worth good money to the right buyer. Never thought someone would just eat it like a normal fruit." He wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that he should have asked before taking food that wasn't his, that he made this mistake all on his own. But the words wouldn't come. His mouth was too busy trying not to vomit as his ki continued to surge and crash inside him like a living thing desperate to escape. The vendor helped him to his feet with surprising strength for someone her age, guiding him away from the stand, away from the gathering crowd of early morning shoppers who were starting to stare. "Go," she urged quietly. "Find somewhere safe to let that power settle. And stay away from the water, you hear me? At least until you learn to control what you've become." Gohan stumbled away from the village, the coins clutched uselessly in his fist, his body racked with changes he couldn't stop and didn't understand. The horizon was starting to lighten, the sky shifting from black to deep purple, and he found himself staggering toward a rocky outcropping far enough from the settlement that no one would witness whatever was about to happen. When he reached it, he fell to his knees and let the transformation take him. His ki erupted outward in a golden explosion that lit up the beach like a second sunrise. But instead of the clean, controlled aura he'd spent years mastering, this was wild and chaotic, shot through with strange fluctuations that made it pulse and surge unpredictably. He could feel the amplification the fruit had granted him. His energy was easily 3 times what it had been, maybe more. But controlling it was like trying to hold water in his bare hands. Gohan threw back his head and screamed, not from pain but from frustration and fear and the overwhelming sense of wrongness that came with having your fundamental nature rewritten without your consent. The sound echoed across the empty beach, raw and primal, carrying all the anguish of a warrior who'd just realized he was more lost than he'd ever been. When the initial surge finally subsided, minutes or hours later, he couldn't tell, he collapsed forward, palms flat against the stone, breathing hard. His reflection stared back at him from a tidal pool a few feet away, and what he saw made something cold settle in his chest. His eyes were different. Still dark, still recognizably his own, but carrying a new quality, an intensity that hadn't been there before, like his gaze had been sharpened to a cutting edge. And around him, barely visible in the growing dawn, his aura flickered with those same golden swirls he'd seen on the fruit's surface. The amplification wasn't just increasing his power, it was marking him, changing him into something this world would recognize as other. "I can't go home like this," he realized with dawning horror. "Even if I find a way back, I'm not entirely me anymore." The thought should have broken him. Should have sent him spiraling into despair or rage or any of the other destructive emotions that had plagued him throughout his life. Instead, something else settled over him, something colder, more analytical. The part of him that was Gohan the scholar, the researcher, the man who'd spent his adult life studying problems until he understood them well enough to solve them. He didn't know the rules of this world yet. Didn't understand how devil fruits worked, or what exactly had happened to his ki, or whether there was a way to reverse this curse. But he would learn, would study and experiment, and push himself until he mapped out every variable, every possibility, every potential path forward. It was what he did. What he'd always done, even when the world expected him to just fight and win and not ask questions about the underlying mechanics of the power he wielded. Gohan pulled himself to his feet, testing his balance against the lighter gravity and the new weight of his amplified ki. The sun was rising properly now, painting the ocean in shades of gold and pink that would have been beautiful if he wasn't acutely aware of the danger that water now represented. Even looking at it made him feel slightly weaker, as though the sight alone could drain him. He turned his back on the sea and started walking inland, following a path that led away from the village, away from people who might ask questions he couldn't answer. He needed space to think, needed time to adapt to these changes before he tried to navigate whatever passed for civilization in this world. The path wound through sparse forests, strange trees with purple bark and leaves that chimed softly in the breeze, before opening up onto a cliff overlooking the interior of the island. From this vantage point, Gohan could see more settlements scattered across the landscape, connected by dirt roads and what looked like crude train tracks. Smoke rose from chimneys. Ships moved in the distant harbor. Life continued, oblivious to the displaced warrior trying to make sense of his new reality. He sat down on the cliff's edge, legs dangling over the drop, and tried to fly. The attempt was instinctive, a reflex honed by decades of aerial combat. He gathered his ki, focused it downward, prepared to push off the ground and soar up into the morning sky. But when he jumped, when he tried to channel his energy the way he'd done thousands of times before, something went catastrophically wrong. His amplified ki responded too strongly, launching him upward with far more force than he'd intended. He shot into the air like a missile, the ground falling away at terrifying speed, the wind tearing at his shredded gi. For a moment he was weightless, flying properly, and then the amplification cut out, his control slipping, and he was falling. Gohan twisted desperately, trying to right himself, but his ki wouldn't respond correctly. Every attempt to stabilize just made things worse, sent him spinning in new directions. The ocean rushed up to meet him, dark and hungry, and pure panic flooded his system as he remembered the vendor's warning. Water will drain you faster than bleeding out. He managed to angle his trajectory at the last second, using a burst of poorly controlled ki to shove himself sideways. He hit the beach instead of the surf, crashed into the sand with enough force to leave a crater, every bone in his body screaming from the impact. For a long moment he just lay there, staring up at the sky, lungs working frantically. His healing factor was already engaging, knitting together cracked ribs and torn muscles, but the pain was a sharp reminder of just how badly he'd miscalculated. Without proper control over his amplified energy, he was as likely to kill himself as any enemy. Gohan dragged himself out of the crater, sand clinging to his bloodied skin, and looked at the ocean with something approaching hatred. In his world, water had always been neutral, sometimes an obstacle, occasionally useful for training, but never actively malevolent. Here it was his enemy, a vast and patient predator waiting for him to make a mistake. He thought of his father, who died from a heart virus. Thought of Piccolo, who'd sacrificed himself against Nappa. Thought of future Trunks' timeline, where everyone had died because they weren't strong enough or fast enough or lucky enough to survive. In all those scenarios, the threat had been something you could fight, an enemy with a face, a weakness you could exploit, a puzzle you could solve through superior strategy or power. But this? Being trapped in another world, cursed by a fruit he'd eaten out of hunger and desperation, unable to even fly without risking his own life? This was a different kind of helplessness, and it terrified him in ways that Cell and Bu and all the other monsters of his youth never had. The sun climbed higher, warming the sand, and Gohan remained sitting at the edge of the crater he'd made, watching the waves roll in with the kind of attention he usually reserved for academic papers. Every seventh wave was slightly larger. The tide was coming in, the water advancing across the beach in inexorable increments. In an hour, maybe two, it would reach where he sat. He should move. Should find shelter, find food, find some way to adapt to this cursed existence. But the exhaustion that settled over him was more than physical. It was the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been fighting his entire life, and just realized the war might never end, that there might always be another threat, another challenge, another impossible situation to somehow survive. I'm so tired, he thought, and hated himself for the weakness. His father would never have given up, would have laughed and made it into another training opportunity, would have turned this curse into just another obstacle to overcome on the path to greater strength. But Gohan wasn't Goku, had never wanted to be Goku. He'd wanted to be a scholar, a father, someone whose greatest battles were fought with equations and research papers. Instead, he was this, a warrior displaced across dimensions, cursed by a fruit that amplified the very power he'd spent years trying to distance himself from, trapped in a world whose rules he didn't understand and whose ocean wanted him dead. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd always been afraid of losing control, of the monster that lived inside him, the part that had enjoyed brutalizing Cell, that had taken pleasure in demonstrating his superiority over an enemy he could have simply killed. Now he had even more power, amplified and unpredictable, with even less ability to control it. What if I hurt someone? The thought crept in like cold water through cracks. What if I lose control here, where there's no Piccolo to stop me, no Goku to intervene, no Dragon Balls to undo the damage? Gohan looked down at his hands, the hands that had killed Cell, that had held his infant daughter with impossible gentleness, that could now apparently launch him into the stratosphere if he wasn't careful. They were shaking slightly, not from exhaustion but from the effort of containing the amplified ki that wanted to burst free at every opportunity. He needed training. Needed someone who understood this world's power systems well enough to teach him control. But who? How did he even begin to look for something like that when he didn't know the geography, the politics, the social structures that governed this place? The answer, when it came, was simple but unpalatable. He would have to involve himself with the people here, would have to ask questions, make connections, potentially put others at risk until he learned enough to be safe. It went against every protective instinct he had, but there was no alternative. He couldn't figure this out alone, not when the fundamental rules of reality were different here. Gohan pushed himself to his feet, testing his injuries. The healing factor had done its work. He was bruised and exhausted but functional. The sun was higher now, the beach growing uncomfortably warm, and he could see figures moving in the distance. People from the village, probably, coming to investigate the explosion of light and the sound of someone crashing into their beach at terminal velocity. He should leave before they arrived. Should find somewhere isolated to practice with his new powers, somewhere he couldn't accidentally hurt anyone. But another part of him, the part that had been alone on this beach, in this world, with no way home and no one to turn to, desperately wanted to not be alone anymore. So he waited, sitting at the edge of his impact crater, watching the villagers approach with a mixture of wariness and hope. Maybe they would have answers. Maybe they would know someone who could help. Or maybe they would just see another cursed fool who'd eaten a devil fruit without understanding the price. Either way, Gohan realized as the first of them drew close enough for him to see their expressions. Curiosity mixed with fear, mixed with the kind of practiced caution that came from living in a world where the strange could be dangerous. He was committed now. There was no going back to ignorance, no pretending he could handle this alone. The weight of another sky pressed down on him, and under it, Gohan began to understand that survival in this world would mean becoming someone he'd spent his entire life trying not to be. A warrior with no choice but to fight, a stranger with no home to return to, a man defined by power he never wanted but could no longer escape. The first villager reached the crater's edge and stared down at him with wide eyes. "Are you?" The man hesitated, clearly struggling with how to phrase the question. "Are you all right, son?" Gohan looked up at him, at this stranger from another world who just watched him fall from the sky and somehow survive, and realized he had no idea how to answer that question. Was he all right? His body was healing. His mind was functional. But everything that made him him, his family, his purpose, his carefully constructed life, was impossibly far away, possibly forever. "I don't know," Gohan said finally, the honesty surprising him. "I really don't know." The man nodded slowly, as though this made perfect sense, and extended a hand to help him up. "Well then, why don't you come back to the village? We can at least get you some proper clothes and a meal. Then we can figure out what you are and what you've become." Gohan took the offered hand, letting himself be pulled from the crater, and followed the stranger toward a settlement that would never be home but was, for now, the only refuge he had. Behind them, the ocean continued its patient advance, and somewhere in a dimension he could no longer reach, his family was waking up to find him gone. The weight of another sky pressed down on shoulders that had always been stronger than he wanted them to be, and Gohan took his first real steps into a world that would challenge everything he thought he understood about power, purpose, and the price of survival. The village, Hakamai, they called it, smelled of salt and wood smoke and something else Gohan couldn't quite identify. A kind of lived-in weariness that permeated everything, from the weathered planks of the buildings to the careful way people watched strangers pass. He'd been here 3 weeks now, and the sensation of being perpetually observed had yet to fade. The man who'd pulled him from the crater, Kenji, a fisherman with hands like tanned leather and eyes that had seen too much ocean, had taken him to a boarding house run by a widow named Tomo. She'd asked no questions when Kenji explained that Gohan had eaten something he shouldn't have, just nodded with the resigned familiarity of someone who'd witnessed this particular tragedy before, and shown him to a small room overlooking the harbor. The clothes she'd given him were strange. Loose pants that gathered at the ankles, a simple shirt that tied at the side, and a coat that felt too heavy for the climate but which everyone here seemed to wear regardless. When he'd caught his reflection in the wash basin that first night, he'd barely recognized himself. The torn GI that had marked him as a martial artist, as someone from a world where ki and capsules and senzu beans were reality, was gone. In its place was the costume of this world, and wearing it felt like putting on someone else's skin. His amplified ki had settled somewhat in those first days, the initial violent surges giving way to a constant simmer just beneath his skin. It was like living with a second heartbeat, this new awareness of power that wanted to be used, that pressed against the boundaries of his control with patient insistence. At night, alone in his room, he would practice channeling it in small amounts, forming spheres of energy no larger than marbles, trying to maintain them for longer than a few seconds before they destabilized and dissipated into nothing. The progress was glacial and frustrating in equal measure. What should have taken him minutes to master was taking weeks, and the gap between what he knew he should be capable of and what he could actually accomplish yawned wider with each failed attempt. Tomo had work that needed doing, repairs to the boarding house, errands that required someone young and strong, and Gohan had thrown himself into it with an intensity that probably seemed strange to her. But the physical labor was grounding, gave him something to focus on besides the constant background awareness that he was trapped in another dimension with no clear path home. When he was hauling timber or fixing broken shutters, he could almost pretend this was just another challenge to overcome, another problem with a solution waiting to be found. The villagers had accepted him with the kind of cautious hospitality that suggested they'd seen strange things before and learned not to ask too many questions. Several of them had eaten devil fruits themselves. He'd seen a man who could turn his hands into scissors, a woman whose hair moved like it was alive, a child who could flatten themselves like paper and slide under doors. The powers were varied and often bizarre, but what united everyone who bore them was that subtle weakness around water, that shared curse that marked them as other. "You're lucky," Kenji had told him one evening over cheap sake in Tomo's kitchen. "The Kenki no Mi is rare. Most devil fruits give you one trick: turn into an animal, manipulate an element, transform your body into something weird. But yours? It amplifies what you already have, makes you more of what you already were." He'd paused, studying Gohan with those ocean-weathered eyes. "Question is, what were you before you ate it?" Gohan hadn't known how to answer that. What was he? A scholar who'd been forced into the role of warrior? A Saiyan hybrid who never quite fit in either world? A father and husband who'd failed the most basic duty of being there for his family? The question had haunted him through the days that followed, echoing in the spaces between tasks, in the quiet moments before sleep claimed him. Who was Son Gohan in a world where everything that had defined him was impossibly far away? It was during one of these spirals of introspection, while he was repairing a section of dock that had rotted through, that he first heard about Sabaody Archipelago. Two merchants were arguing on the pier, their voices carrying across the water as Gohan worked. One wanted to hire a ship to take goods to Sabaody. The other thought it was too dangerous given the recent reports of pirates and marines clashing near the archipelago's bubble forests. "But that's exactly why prices are so high right now," the first merchant insisted. "Risk means profit. And besides, if we can get our shipment there before the next auction." "The human auction?" The second merchant's voice dropped to a disgusted whisper. I want no part of that business. I'm not saying we participate, just that we take advantage of the crowds. The archipelago is always busy before an auction. Rich nobles, pirates looking to show off their wealth, bounty hunters cashing in. It's the perfect opportunity if you've got the stomach for it. The conversation had continued, but Gohan had stopped listening, his hands frozen on the timber he'd been securing. Human auction. The words sat in his mind like shards of glass, cutting in ways he couldn't quite process. This world had slavery, not as a historical artifact or a shameful past, but as an active, ongoing institution that people discussed with the casual pragmatism of merchants evaluating market conditions. His ki had flared involuntarily, the amplification kicking in before he could stop it, and the board he'd been holding had splintered in his grip. The merchants had looked over, startled by the sound, but Gohan had already turned away, forcing his energy back under control, trying to breathe through the sudden surge of rage that threatened to consume his careful equilibrium. That night he'd asked Tomo about it. About Sabaody, about the auctions, about how a world could function with such casual cruelty woven into its fabric. She'd looked at him with something between pity and resignation, the same expression he'd seen on Kenji's face when explaining devil fruits. The world is bigger than you think, boy, she'd said quietly, pouring them both tea that smelled of jasmine and something bitter. And crueler, the world government controls most of it, has for 800 years. They say it's for order, for peace, but... She trailed off, staring into her cup like it held answers either of them wanted to face. There are people who fight against it. Pirates, mostly, though not all pirates are heroes and not all marines are villains. It's complicated. How can people just accept it? The question had come out more harshly than he'd intended. How can they know this is happening and not what? Rise up? Fight back? Tomo had laughed, but there was no humor in it. Against the world government? Against the marines and the admirals and the warlords? Most people are just trying to survive, boy. Trying to feed their families and keep their homes safe. You can't fight an ocean with your bare hands. But Gohan had fought oceans. Had fought gods and demons and androids and pink monsters that could destroy planets with a thought. The idea that power could be allowed to exist unchecked, that cruelty could continue simply because resistance was difficult, went against everything he'd been raised to believe. Piccolo's voice echoed in his memory. Power means responsibility, Gohan. The strong protect the weak. That's not a choice, it's an obligation. Yet here he was, in a world where the strong exploited the weak as a matter of policy, and he'd spent 3 weeks fixing roofs and hauling cargo instead of doing something about it. The realization had settled over him like a weight he'd forgotten he was carrying. He'd been so focused on his own displacement, his own problems, that he'd ignored the larger context of where he'd landed. This world was suffering, and he had power, amplified, poorly controlled power, but power nonetheless. What was he supposed to do with that? The answer had come 2 days later, delivered in the form of rumors that spread through Hakama like wildfire. There was going to be a major auction in Sabaody soon, and a particularly notorious pirate crew had been captured for sale. The details were vague, but the excitement among certain merchants was palpable. This was apparently a big event, the kind that drew crowds from across the surrounding seas. Gohan had made his decision that night. He would go to Sabaody archipelago. Not to participate, not to observe from a safe distance, but to understand this world well enough to know what it needed from him. And if he happened to arrive during an auction, if he happened to be present when human beings were being bought and sold like property, well, he'd figure out what to do when he got there. The journey to Sabaody took 5 days by merchant vessel, and Gohan spent most of it at the bow of the ship, watching the horizon and trying not to think about how the ocean beneath them wanted him dead. The captain, a grizzled woman named Mira who'd seen enough of the world to be unfazed by a quiet young man with haunted eyes, had given him space, seeming to understand that whatever drove him toward the archipelago wasn't something that invited casual conversation. The first sight of Sabaody archipelago stole his breath. Trees. Impossibly massive trees rising from the ocean itself, their roots disappearing into depths he couldn't fathom, their canopies so high they vanished into clouds. But more than that, bubbles. Thousands upon thousands of iridescent bubbles floating up from the roots. drifting through the air like some kind of natural phenomenon that defied everything Gohan understood about physics. Some were tiny, barely larger than his fist. Others were massive, large enough to contain buildings, and he could see structures built atop them. Entire neighborhoods suspended in the air on bubbles that by all rights should have popped instantly. First time seeing the Urukuman mangrove? Mera had appeared beside him, her own expression softened by what might have been nostalgia. Never gets old, does it? The resin from the roots creates those bubbles. They're strong enough to build on, long as you stay in the archipelago's atmosphere. Try to take them too far out to sea and they pop like nothing. Gohan had wanted to ask about the chemistry, about how resin could create stable structures that defied surface tension on such a scale. But the questions died in his throat as they drew closer and he began to see the archipelago's details more clearly. The division of the groves by number, each one serving a different purpose. The mix of legitimate businesses and obvious criminal enterprises operating side by side. The sheer density of people moving through the bubble bridges and walkways. A mix of species and sizes that made his earlier observations in Hakamai seem quaint by comparison. And everywhere, the subtle signs of violence barely contained, Marines patrolling in groups, their weapons held ready. Pirates swagger through crowds, their Jolly Rogers displayed with aggressive pride. People who flinched at sudden movements, who kept their eyes down and their voices low, who had learned to make themselves invisible in a place where attention could be fatal. They docked at Grove 30, and Mera had wished him luck with the kind of finality that suggested she didn't expect to see him again. Gohan had thanked her for the passage. Payment had been work, helping load and unload cargo at every stop, and stepped onto Sabaody soil for the first time with no clear plan beyond finding information. The archipelago was organized chaos. Each grove had its own character, its own unspoken rules. The lawless zone, groves 1 through 29, where pirates and criminals operated openly. The shopping and entertainment districts in the middle groves. The marine base and government facilities in the upper numbers. Gohan wandered through them with the peculiar detachment of someone observing a foreign culture, cataloging details, trying to build a mental map of how this society functioned. It was in Grove 13, while watching a group of pirates extort a merchant for protection money, that he first felt it. The presence was subtle at first, like the pressure change before a storm. Not hostile, exactly, but aware. A attention focused on him with the kind of precision that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Gohan turned slowly, scanning the crowd, his amplified ki responding to the perceived threat by surging beneath his skin in ways he had to actively suppress. There, on the edge of a building's rooftop, barely visible in the afternoon shadows, stood a man. The distance was too great for normal human vision to make out details, but Gohan's Saiyan eyes caught the silver hair, the casual posture that somehow conveyed absolute confidence, and the way the man was looking directly at him despite the crowd of people between them. Then the man was gone. Not running, not jumping, just absent, like he'd never been there at all. But the sensation of being watched remained, and Gohan realized with a sinking feeling that whatever he'd hoped to accomplish here by staying unnoticed was already impossible. Someone had marked him, and that someone had moved with a speed that even his trained eyes had barely registered. The next 2 days passed in a strange tension. Gohan continued his exploration of Sabaody, gathering information about the upcoming auction. 3 days away, he learned, with premium stock that had everyone excited, about the power structures that governed the archipelago, about the strange coding process that allowed ships to travel beneath the ocean to reach something called the New World. But through it all, he felt that presence returning periodically, that same focused attention studying him from various vantage points. Whoever was watching him was patient, content to observe rather than confront. And somehow, that was more unsettling than if they'd simply attacked. It wasn't until the third evening, when Gohan had found a quiet grove away from the crowds to practice his ki control, that the Watcher finally revealed himself. "You move like you're expecting gravity to be negotiable." The voice came from behind him. Impossible, because Gohan had been checking his surroundings constantly, and he spun to find the silver-haired man standing there with his hands in his pockets and an expression of mild interest on a face that carried the kind of weathering that came from decades of hard living. Up close, the man was less imposing than Gohan had expected. Average height, lean build, dressed in simple clothes that wouldn't have looked out of place on any of the archipelago's residents. But his eyes, dark, knowing, carrying the weight of 1,000 battles, saw through Gohan's carefully constructed normalcy with unnerving ease. "You're not from around here," the man continued, and it wasn't a question. "Your stance is wrong. Too wide, too stable, like you're used to fighting in the air. And that energy you're trying to suppress?" He gestured vaguely at Gohan's midsection. "It's nothing like hockey, but it's not completely different either. What are you, boy?" Gohan's first instinct was to deflect, to lie, to protect the truth of his origin the way he'd been taught to protect his identity as the Great Samaritan. But something about this man's directness, about the way he asked like he genuinely wanted to understand rather than exploit, made him pause. "I'm from somewhere else," Gohan said carefully. "Somewhere where the rules are different. And I ate a devil fruit that amplified something I already had. And now I'm trying to figure out how to control it in a world that doesn't work the way mine did." The man studied him for a long moment, and Gohan had the unsettling sensation of being dissected by that gaze, of having layers of carefully constructed defense stripped away until only the truth remained. Then the man smiled, not mockingly, but with something that might have been approval. "Silver's Rayleigh," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "Though some people call me the Dark King, which always seemed a bit dramatic to me." "And you are?" "Son Gohan." The handshake was firm, neither challenging nor submissive. "Though I'm starting to think that name means something different here than it did where I'm from." "The D," Rayleigh said thoughtfully. "Son D, Gohan." "Yes, that would mean something here. Quite a lot, actually, though I doubt you understand why yet." He gestured to a nearby bubble bench, an invitation rather than a command. "Sit. Let's talk about what you are and what you're trying to become." Against his better judgment, Gohan sat. And as the sun set over Sabaody Archipelago, painting the massive trees in shades of gold and crimson, he found himself explaining to a stranger things he'd barely admitted to himself: the dimensional tear, the world he'd left behind, the family he couldn't reach, the devil fruit that had rewritten his fundamental nature, and the desperate need to understand this new reality well enough to survive it. Rayleigh listened without interruption, his expression giving nothing away, until Gohan's voice trailed off into silence. Then the older man leaned back, staring up at the darkening sky with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten none of it. 20 years ago, Rayleigh said quietly, I sailed with a man who turned his execution into the catalyst for an age of dreams. He was going to die anyway, terminal illness, though he never told most people that. So he stood on that platform and told the world his treasure was real, that everything he'd found was out there waiting for whoever was strong enough to claim it. And the world went mad trying to find it. He looked at Gohan then, and something in his expression made the younger man's breath catch. He was my captain. My friend. And he had this way of seeing through people, of understanding what they needed before they knew it themselves. If he were here now, he'd take one look at you and laugh, not at you, with you. Because he'd recognize what you're really afraid of. And what's that? Gohan asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. That you're exactly where you're supposed to be, Rayleigh said simply. That whatever brought you to this world wasn't an accident or a mistake, but something you needed. You're running from something back home, boy. Not a threat or an enemy, those you'd face without hesitation. You're running from a question you don't want to answer about who you're supposed to be. The observation cut deeper than any physical blow could have. Gohan wanted to deny it, to insist that he'd been pulled here against his will, that he was a victim of circumstance. But sitting there in the growing darkness, watching bubbles drift past with their impossible buoyancy, he couldn't quite make himself lie. He had been running. Running from the expectations that came with being Goku's son, from the pressure to be Earth's protector when he never wanted that role, from the gap between the peaceful life he craved and the warrior everyone expected him to be. The dimensional tear hadn't stolen him from his world, it had offered him an escape, and some part of him had taken it. I can teach you, Rayleigh offered into the silence. Control over that energy you're carrying. Understanding of how power works in this world. But I need you to understand something first. Training with me means confronting exactly what you're afraid of. It means looking at that amplified energy and asking yourself why it scares you so much. Can you do that? Gohan thought of Pan, who would never know her father had run away. Thought of Videl, who deserved better than a husband who disappeared without explanation. Thought of his mother, who'd spent his entire childhood terrified he'd die the way his father had. But he also thought of the human auction 3 days away. Thought of the casual cruelty he'd witnessed in just a few days on this archipelago. Thought of a world that needed people willing to fight tyranny, and how he'd been given power specifically designed to make him more effective at exactly that kind of fight. I don't know if I can be what this world needs, he admitted. I don't know if I want to be that person. Rayleigh's smile was sad and knowing. No one ever does. But the fact that you're asking the question means you're already halfway there. So what do you say, son D, Gohan? Are you ready to stop running? The bubbles continued their impossible ascent into the night sky, and somewhere in the archipelago, preparations continued for an auction that would sell human beings like property. Gohan looked at his hands, the hands that could destroy mountains or hold his daughter with impossible gentleness, and felt his amplified ki stir in response to the decision taking shape in his mind. He wasn't ready. Might never be ready. But Rayleigh was right about one thing. He was tired of running. Teach me, Gohan said, and felt something fundamental shift in the space between decision and commitment. Teach me how to control this power. And then, he looked toward the groves where the auction house waited, where people's lives would be reduced to commerce and cruelty. Then help me figure out what to do about what I've learned about this world. Rayleigh's expression shifted into something that might have been approval, or might have been concern. Careful, boy. That kind of thinking is how people end up with bounties on their heads and the world government hunting them across every sea. Are you sure that's a burden you want to carry? Gohan thought of Cell, of the moment he'd finally accepted what he was and stopped apologizing for it. Thought of standing over Android 16's broken body, making the choice to embrace the monster everyone feared he'd become because it was the only way to protect what mattered. No, he said honestly. But I'm not sure that matters anymore. The Dark King laughed then, a sound like distant thunder, and extended his hand again. Then welcome to the truly dangerous path, son D, Gohan. Training starts tomorrow at dawn, and fair warning, by the time I'm done with you, you're going to wish you'd stayed lost in whatever dimension you fell from. As they shook hands, sealing an agreement that would reshape everything Gohan thought he understood about power and purpose, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows of Grove 41. A Marine captain with a scar across his face and orders to investigate rumors of someone with impossible power asking dangerous questions about the world government. The pieces were being set on a board larger than any of them could see, and the game that would determine Gohan's place in this world was already in motion, whether he was ready for it or not. The training began in darkness, hours before dawn, when Sabaody Archipelago lay quiet beneath a sky still scattered with stars. Gohan had barely slept. The boarding house bed felt foreign after weeks of adaptation, and his amplified ki had thrummed beneath his skin with restless energy, as though it sensed what was coming and was either eager or terrified. He couldn't quite tell which, and the ambiguity unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Rayleigh was waiting at Grove 42, in a clearing that existed in the liminal space between the lawless zone and the more civilized groves. The older man sat cross-legged on the grass, eyes closed, breathing so shallow that for a moment Gohan thought he might actually be asleep. But as Gohan's footsteps carried him closer, disturbing the pre-dawn stillness, Rayleigh spoke without opening his eyes. You're early. Good. Punctuality suggests either discipline or desperation, and I suspect you're carrying both in equal measure. His eyes opened then, catching what little starlight remained. Before we begin, I need to understand what we're working with. Show me your energy. Not an attack, just let me feel what that devil fruit did to you. Gohan hesitated, remembering the violent surges of those first days, the way his ki had felt like a living thing trying to claw its way out of his body. But he closed his eyes and reached inward, finding that familiar well of power that had sustained him through every battle of his life. Except now it wasn't just a well, it was an ocean, vast and turbulent, amplified beyond anything he'd known before the fruit. He let it surface slowly, carefully, like releasing pressure from a valve 1 degree at a time. Golden light began to emanate from his skin, not the clean aura he'd spent years mastering but something wilder, shot through with those strange swirling patterns that marked him as changed. The air around them grew heavy with power, and Gohan felt the familiar thrill-terror of his own strength, the double-edged awareness that he could protect anything or destroy everything, and the margin between the two was measured in moments of control. Rayleigh's eyes widened fractionally, the only sign of surprise the older man allowed himself. He stood, circling Gohan like a scholar examining an artifact, one hand extended to feel the disturbances in the air where the amplified ki pressed against reality itself. Extraordinary, Rayleigh murmured, more to himself than to Gohan. It's not hockey. The fundamental structure is completely different, but there's a resonance, like hearing two instruments playing in harmony despite being tuned to different scales. He stopped in front of Gohan, meeting his eyes with an intensity that felt like being seen through. Your devil fruit didn't just amplify your power. It made your internal energy externally reactive. Every emotion, every thought, every moment of hesitation or conviction, it's all being broadcast through this aura. Do you understand what that means? Gohan shook his head, still maintaining the delicate balance of his released ki, feeling sweat already beginning to bead on his forehead from the concentration required to keep it stable. It means you're carrying a weapon that reflects your soul, Rayleigh said quietly, and something in his tone made Gohan's blood run cold. When you're confident, focused, certain of your purpose, that energy will be devastating, precise, unstoppable. But when you're afraid, when you doubt yourself, when your resolve wavers? He gestured to the way Gohan's aura was flickering, pulsing with irregular rhythms that matched the uncertainty churning in his chest. That amplification will turn against you. It will magnify every weakness, every hesitation. What happens when your soul is at war with itself, Son D? Gohan? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Gohan didn't want to examine too closely. He thought of Cell, of how he'd frozen when given the opportunity to end the fight quickly, how his mercy had cost his father's life. Thought of all the times Piccolo had pushed him to embrace his power while his mother had begged him to be normal, safe, anything other than what his blood demanded he become. His entire life had been a war between the scholar who wanted peace and the warrior whose very existence invited violence. And now that war was literally written across his energy, visible to anyone who knew how to look. I see, Gohan said quietly, letting his ki retract, pulling it back beneath his skin where it settled with reluctant resistance. So you're saying I need to resolve that conflict before I can control this power? I'm saying, Rayleigh corrected, that controlling this power will force you to resolve that conflict whether you want to or not. You can't hide from yourself when your own energy is holding up a mirror. He moved to the center of the clearing, gesturing for Gohan to join him. We'll start with the basics. Forget everything you know about fighting. Forget your transformations, your techniques, everything you learned in your world. Here, now, you're going to learn what it means to impose your will upon reality itself. The first lesson was breath. It seemed absurdly simple. Rayleigh had him sit, legs crossed, hands resting on his knees, and focus solely on the rhythm of air moving in and out of his lungs. But within minutes, Gohan understood the deception of simplicity. His amplified ki wanted to surge with each inhale, wanted to dissipate with each exhale, keeping it stable, maintaining equilibrium while his body performed its most basic function, required a level of concentration that made his previous training seem almost trivial by comparison. Your energy responds to intention, Rayleigh explained, his own breathing so controlled it was almost imperceptible. Right now, you're treating it like a wild animal, something to be contained, suppressed, controlled through force. But that's not control. That's just a stronger cage. Real mastery means understanding that the energy and the wielder are not separate things. Your ki isn't something you have, it's something you are. Gohan wanted to argue that he'd known this for years, that he'd been manipulating his ki since childhood, that he understood the connection between warrior and energy better than most. But even as the protests formed, he felt his aura flicker, responding to the defensiveness rising in his chest, and understood with uncomfortable clarity that Rayleigh was right. He'd been fighting his own power, treating it as something external that needed to be beaten into submission rather than integrated into his sense of self. The realization was both humbling and infuriating, and his ki surged violently in response to the emotional cocktail, forcing him to abort the meditation before it spiraled completely out of control. Again, Rayleigh said simply, and there was no judgment in his tone, just patient expectation. So Gohan tried again. And again. And again, as the sun crept above the horizon and painted the clearing in shades of gold and amber. Each time, he made it a little longer before his emotions destabilized his energy. Each time, he understood a little more about the fundamental difference between suppressing power and actually controlling it. By the time Rayleigh called a break, Gohan's shirt was soaked through with sweat despite having barely moved, and his head pounded with the peculiar exhaustion that came from intense mental effort. But his ki felt different, not tamed, not even notably more controllable, but somehow more present, like he'd taken the first step toward acknowledging its existence as something integrated with his consciousness rather than separate from it. "You're learning faster than I expected," Rayleigh observed, tossing him a canteen of water. "Most people take weeks to even begin understanding the concept. You grasped it in a morning, even if executing it is still beyond you." "I had good teachers," Gohan said quietly, thinking of Piccolo's brutal training, of the hyperbolic time chamber, of Whis explaining divine ki with the patient precision of someone who'd taught gods. Though none of them quite approached it this way. "Different worlds, different methods," Rayleigh agreed. "But the principle is universal. Power without self-knowledge is just destruction waiting for a target." Now, he stood, brushing grass from his pants with casual efficiency. "Let's talk about hockey. You said your world had something similar, something you called ki. But did you ever use it to see the future?" Gohan blinked at the abrupt shift in topic. "See the what?" Rayleigh's smile was almost predatory. "Observation hockey. The ability to sense the presence, emotions, and intentions of others. At its highest levels, you can perceive events before they happen, not through precognition, exactly, but by reading the infinitesimal signs that telegraph action before it occurs, combined with that amplified energy of yours." He trailed off, but the implication was clear. The rest of the morning was devoted to learning to feel the world differently. Rayleigh would attack without warning, never with intent to truly harm, but with enough commitment that Gohan's instincts screamed danger, and Gohan had to learn to sense the strikes before they landed, not through his eyes, which Rayleigh made him close, but through that same awareness he used to sense ki signatures back home. Except here, it wasn't quite the same. Ki had always been about energy, about reading the power signatures of living beings and understanding their strength. Observation hockey was subtler, focused less on power and more on intent. It was the difference between hearing someone's volume and understanding their words. Both used sound, but the information they conveyed operated on different frequencies. The first dozen attacks landed cleanly, Rayleigh's palm striking Gohan's shoulder or ribs with just enough force to sting. But gradually, incrementally, Gohan began to feel something. Not precognition, not quite, but a kind of pressure in the air immediately before Rayleigh moved. Like the universe itself was whispering warnings to anyone who knew how to listen. By the time Rayleigh called for lunch, Gohan had successfully dodged 3 attacks out of 20. It felt like both triumph and humiliation. His younger self would have been mortified by such a poor success rate, but the part of him that had spent years as a scholar understood that learning was always uncomfortable, that competence came only after extended periods of feeling incompetent. They ate in companionable silence, simple fare that Rayleigh had brought, bread, cheese, dried meat that tasted of salt and smoke. Gohan found himself studying the older man, trying to reconcile the patient teacher with the reputation he'd heard whispered in Hakamai and Sabaody. The Dark King, first mate to the Pirate King himself, a man who'd sailed to the end of the world and lived to retire. What did it mean that someone like that had chosen to spend his remaining years in quiet observation rather than continued adventure? "You're wondering why I agreed to train you," Rayleigh said without looking up from his meal, and Gohan startled at having his thoughts read so easily. "You're wondering what I see in you that made this worth my time." "The thought had crossed my mind," Gohan admitted. Rayleigh was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, focused on something beyond the clearing, beyond Sabaody, perhaps beyond this world entirely. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief worn smooth by time. "My captain had a gift for finding people who didn't know what they were yet. He'd take one look at someone and see not what they were, but what they could become if they stopped lying to themselves. A coward who could be brave. A loner who could be loyal. A scholar," his eyes found Gohan's then, sharp and knowing, "who could be a warrior, if he ever forgave himself for being good at violence." The observation struck too close to truths Gohan had spent years avoiding. He looked away, focusing on the remains of his meal, on the pattern of crumbs scattered across his palm. "You remind me of him," Rayleigh continued. "Not in personality. Roger was loud, joyful, and possibly certain of everything he did. but in that same quality of being trapped between who you are and who you think you should be. He grew up believing he'd die young, that his illness would claim him before he could accomplish anything meaningful. So he decided to live so fully, so completely, that his death would matter more than most people's lives. Did it work? Gohan asked quietly. Rayleigh's laugh was soft, tinged with something that might have been pride or might have been sorrow. He turned his execution into the catalyst for an age of dreams. 20 years later, people are still chasing the legacy he left behind. So yes, I'd say it worked. He paused, then added with careful deliberacy. But it cost him everything he loved. Cost all of us who sailed with him, in different ways. That's the thing about living your convictions, boy. Conviction doesn't care about comfort or safety or the people who want you to be someone easier to love. The words settled over Gohan like a familiar weight, reminding him uncomfortably of every argument with his mother, every time Videl had looked at him with worry she tried to hide, every moment Pan had seemed frightened by the power she could sense but couldn't understand. He'd spent his life trying to be someone easier to love, trying to bury the parts of himself that scared people, and it had made him miserable without ever quite succeeding. What if I can't reconcile it? The question came out raw, more vulnerable than he'd intended. What if the scholar and the warrior are fundamentally incompatible, and trying to be both just means failing at everything? Rayleigh studied him with those ancient eyes, and for a moment Gohan felt like he was being measured against some invisible standard. Then the older man smiled, and it was surprisingly gentle. Then you'll fail spectacularly, learn from it, and fail better next time. That's all any of us can do, keep trying until we either succeed or die trying. The question isn't whether you can reconcile those parts of yourself. The question is whether you're brave enough to stop pretending one of them doesn't exist. The afternoon lesson was armament hockey, and it was both easier and harder than observation. The concept was straightforward, coating yourself in an invisible armor of will, hardening your body against attacks that would otherwise break you. But the execution required a different kind of focus, a deliberate assertion of self against the world's tendency toward entropy. Armament is about boundaries, Rayleigh explained, demonstrating by coating his forearm in the characteristic black sheen that Gohan had seen on certain fighters in Sabaody. You're declaring to the universe, this is where I end and everything else begins. For most people, it's purely defensive. But combined with your amplified energy. He trailed off, gesturing for Gohan to attempt it himself. Following the instructions Rayleigh had given, Gohan focused on his arm, on the sensation of his skin as the boundary between self and other. He reached for his ki, trying to channel it outward but contain it, create a shell rather than an explosion. What emerged made both of them stop in surprise. The coating that spread across Gohan's forearm was black, yes, but shot through with veins of gold that pulsed with the same rhythm as his amplified ki. It looked less like armor and more like living metal, organic and crystalline at once, and the sensation was unlike anything Gohan had experienced before. It felt like his ki had been given structure, like the wild energy had found a framework to inhabit that made it simultaneously more controlled and more dangerous. I've never seen that before, Rayleigh said quietly, and there was something in his voice that might have been awe or might have been concern. That shouldn't be possible. Haki and Devil Fruit powers are separate systems. They can work in concert, but they don't merge. Yet your energy and your armament are. He reached out, cautious, and tapped Gohan's coated arm with one finger. The impact sent a small shockwave through the clearing, more force than Rayleigh had put into the touch, and Gohan felt his amplified ki respond to the contact by surging through the armament coating, creating a feedback loop that made the golden veins flare brighter. It's integrating, Gohan realized, his voice distant with analysis. The Devil Fruit amplifies my ki, and the armament gives that amplified energy a structure to inhabit. They're not separate. The fruit made them compatible on a fundamental level. Rayleigh withdrew his hand, his expression thoughtful and slightly troubled. Which means you're creating something new, not Haki as this world understands it, not ki as your world practices it, but some hybrid that draws from both. He met Gohan's eyes, and the concern was clearer now. That kind of uniqueness will attract attention, boy. The world government doesn't like things they can't categorize, can't predict. And what you're developing is unprecedented. The warning was clear, but Gohan found himself less worried than he probably should have been. His entire life had been defined by being unprecedented, the first hybrid, the youngest Super Saiyan, the scholar who could have been Earth's strongest if he'd wanted to be. Being unique had always meant being target, and he'd survived this long by being harder to kill than his enemies expected. "Show me how to control it," he said instead of acknowledging the warning. "If I'm going to be a target anyway, I'd rather be a competent one." Rayleigh's expression shifted into something that might have been respect. "Fair enough. But understand this, control at your level isn't about practice, it's about acceptance. That hybrid coding you just created? It exists because on some level, you've started to accept that you're not entirely the person you were before you came to this world. The more you integrate these changes into your sense of self, the more stable and powerful your abilities will become. But integration means letting go of who you were, and that's not a small thing to ask of yourself." Gohan looked at his arm, at the golden black coating that pulsed with his heartbeat, and thought about home. About Videl teaching at Orange Star High, about Pan learning to fly in the backyard, about his mother's cooking and Piccolo's gruff affection and all the small moments that had defined his life in a universe that was now impossibly far away. Letting go meant accepting he might never see them again. Meant acknowledging that this world, with its pirates and marines and devil fruits, might be his reality now, possibly forever. The coating flickered, responding to the grief that surged through his chest, and for a moment Gohan thought it might destabilize completely. But instead, it pulsed once, bright enough to hurt his eyes, and then settled into a steady rhythm that felt less like armor and more like a second skin. "Good," Rayleigh said softly, and there was approval in his tone mixed with something that sounded like sympathy. "That's the first real step. Acknowledging the cost of power is what separates warriors from fighters. Now," his own arm coated in solid black armament, "let's see how well that integration holds up under pressure." The spar that followed was brutal in its efficiency. Rayleigh moved like water, each strike flowing into the next with the kind of economy that came from decades of combat. He wasn't trying to hurt Gohan, not really, but each impact against his experimental coating tested its limits, forcing the hybrid armament key structure to either adapt or break. Gohan found himself relying on instincts honed across a lifetime of battles, his body moving through defensive patterns before his conscious mind could register the attacks. But here, now, those patterns felt different. His lighter gravity-adapted movements gained a fluidity they'd lacked in his home universe, and his amplified ki responded to his emotional state, the sharp focus of combat, by stabilizing in ways it hadn't during meditation. "I'm better at this when I'm fighting," he realized with uncomfortable clarity. "When I stop thinking and just respond, the power cooperates." It was not a comforting realization. It suggested that Piccolo had been right all along, that he was fundamentally a warrior who'd been trying to force himself into a scholar's shape, and the strain of that forcing had been what made control so difficult. But accepting that meant accepting he'd wasted years trying to be someone he wasn't, that his mother's dreams for him had been fundamentally incompatible with his nature. The conflict made his coating flicker again, and Rayleigh's next strike slipped through, catching him in the ribs with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. Gohan stumbled back, gasping, and felt the older man's disapproval before he heard it. "Stop fighting yourself," Rayleigh commanded, his tone sharp. "You're in a spar. Be present for it. Whatever emotional crisis you're having can wait until after you've proven you can maintain basic defenses." The rebuke stung, precisely because it was deserved. Gohan forced his breathing to steady, forced his mind back to the present moment, forced himself to stop analyzing and just be. His coating stabilized, the gold and black settling into a pattern that felt almost natural, and when Rayleigh's next strike came, he was ready for it. The exchange continued until the sun had moved noticeably across the sky, and by the end Gohan's entire body was coated in the hybrid armament, his movements starting to flow with something approaching the efficiency Rayleigh demonstrated. It wasn't mastery, wasn't even competence by the standards he'd held himself to back home, but it was progress. Tangible, measurable progress toward controlling power that had seemed utterly chaotic just hours before. When Rayleigh finally called a halt, both of them were breathing hard, and Gohan felt the peculiar satisfaction that came from being pushed to his limits without quite breaking. His body ached in ways that felt almost nostalgic, reminded him of training with Piccolo, of the hyperbolic time chamber, of every time he'd been forced to grow stronger through systematic dismantling of his previous limitations. "Not bad," Rayleigh said, and coming from him it felt like high praise. You're adapting faster than anyone I've trained before. Whether that's because you're genuinely talented or because your devil fruit is accelerating your learning, I can't say. But at this rate, you'll have basic mastery of observation and armament within a few months rather than years. And Conqueror's Haki? Gohan asked, remembering Rayleigh had mentioned a third type. The older man's expression grew complicated, something between reluctance and resignation. That's different. Conquerors isn't something you learn. It's something you either have or you don't. It's the manifestation of kingly ambition, the will to stand above others and impose your vision upon the world. Most people don't have it, and trying to awaken it artificially is pointless. Do I have it? The question came out more uncertain than Gohan intended. Rayleigh studied him with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see through layers of carefully constructed defense. I don't know. You have the presence. That much is clear from how people react to you even when you're trying to stay unnoticed. But presence isn't the same as ambition. Conquerors requires you to have a clear vision of what you want to impose upon the world. And frankly, boy, you don't seem to know what you want beyond figuring out how to survive here. It was a fair assessment, and Gohan couldn't quite argue with it. He didn't have kingly ambitions, didn't want to rule or dominate, or impose his will upon others. He never wanted any of that. Had actively fled from the kind of prominence that came with being Earth's protector, had tried to build a life defined by quiet scholarship rather than world-shaking power. But then he thought of the human auction, of the casual cruelty he'd witnessed in just days on Sabaody, of a world that seemed to accept suffering as an inevitable component of existence. And he thought about what it meant that he had power here, unprecedented, amplified power that this world might not have any framework for stopping, and whether continuing to pursue quiet scholarship was even an option anymore. What do I want? The question echoed through the spaces between thoughts, unanswered but no longer quite unacknowledged, because for all his protestations about not wanting to fight, about craving peace and normalcy, there was another truth he never quite admitted: violence came easily to him. Too easily. When he stopped thinking and let his instincts guide him, destruction followed with the inevitability of water seeking level ground. Maybe that was what scared him most. Not that he couldn't control his power, but that he could, and the person he became when he did was someone he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Come back tomorrow, Rayleigh said, interrupting the spiral of introspection. Same time. We'll continue with observation and armament until they're second nature, and then we'll see about whether you've got the will for conquerors. He paused, then added with careful deliberacy, and start thinking about what you want to do after the training, because power without purpose is just destruction waiting for direction, and I'd rather know you've got some sense of direction before I finish making you dangerous. Gohan nodded, too tired to protest or promise anything he couldn't guarantee. He made his way back toward the boarding house as the sun began its descent, his body aching, his mind spinning with everything he'd learned and everything he still needed to understand. The archipelago was shifting into evening mode, the lawless groves growing louder and more dangerous, the legitimate businesses closing up shop, the eternal dance between order and chaos tilting gradually toward the latter. Gohan moved through it like a ghost, aware of eyes tracking him but too exhausted to care about the attention. It wasn't until he reached his room, until he'd stripped off his sweat-soaked clothes and stood before the small mirror Tomo had provided, that he realized how much he'd changed in just one day. His eyes held that new intensity, sharper somehow, as though seeing the world through the lens of observation Haki had altered something fundamental about his gaze. And when he summoned his ki experimentally, just a flicker, nothing more, it responded with that same golden-black pattern, the hybrid coding manifesting without conscious effort. He was becoming something new. Not quite the scholar from his home universe, not quite the warrior this world seemed to demand. Something in between, something unprecedented, something that would either save him or destroy him depending on variables he couldn't yet predict. Gohan lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and tried not to think about how his family would barely recognize him if they could see him now. Tried not to think about how part of him was relieved by that distance, by the opportunity to finally stop pretending he was someone he wasn't. Sleep came eventually, heavy and dreamless, and in the morning he would return to training, would continue the slow, painful process of integrating power he never asked for into a sense of self he never quite accepted. But for now, in the quiet darkness of a room in a world that would never quite feel like home, Gohan let himself simply exist, either scholar nor warrior, either earthling nor Saiyan, just a man caught between definitions, and trying desperately to find a way to live with the weight of another sky. The days bled together after that, measured not in hours but in incremental gains that felt simultaneously monumental and insufficient. Gohan would wake before dawn, his body protesting the relentless training even as his Saiyan physiology worked overtime to adapt, to rebuild stronger, to prepare for the next round of systematic dismantling. He'd stumbled through those first weeks with the peculiar vertigo of someone relearning how to walk. Every instinct he'd honed across a lifetime of combat suddenly suspect. Every technique requiring translation into a framework his body no longer quite recognized. Rayleigh was merciless in his consistency, neither cruel nor particularly gentle, just present each morning with that same patient expectation that communicated more clearly than words ever could. You are capable of more than you're allowing yourself to be. The old pirate had a way of seeing through excuses before they fully formed, of reading the telltale fluctuations in Gohan's hybrid aura that betrayed emotional currents the younger man thought he'd hidden. Your energy doesn't lie, Rayleigh had told him during the second week, after a particularly frustrating session where Gohan's observation haki had failed to manifest despite hours of effort. You can deceive me with words, with expressions, with every social mask humans learn to wear. But that amplified ki of yours? It broadcasts your truth whether you want it to or not. The observation had been uncomfortably accurate. Gohan's aura had developed an almost semantic quality. Different emotional states produced distinct patterns in the golden black swirls that now seemed permanently etched into his energy signature. Fear made it contract, sharp and crystalline. Anger caused wild fluctuations that threatened to destabilize his armament coating. But focus, genuine, present moment focus that required him to stop worrying about past or future, produced a clarity that made his hybrid haki sing with dangerous precision. He'd learned to weaponize that clarity during their sparring sessions. Rayleigh would come at him with the casual efficiency of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of controlled violence, and Gohan would respond by shutting down every part of his mind except the immediate tactical problem. No room for analyzing his performance, no space for worrying about control, just the pure flow state that came from treating combat as a conversation conducted through force and intention. In those moments, his observation haki would activate without conscious effort, painting the world in gradients of probable futures. He'd see Rayleigh's next strike before the older man's muscles committed to the motion, not through precognition exactly, but through reading the microscopic tells that preceded action. The slight shift of weight, the infinitesimal change in breathing, the way intention rippled through the air like heat distortion. His armament would harden in response, the golden black coating spreading across his body with fluid speed, and the impact would send shockwaves through the clearing that made the bubble-coated trees tremble. But those moments of clarity were islands in a sea of uncertainty. Outside the structured environment of training, Gohan found himself adrift in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The archipelago continued its chaotic existence around him. Pirates swaggering through the lawless groves, Marines conducting periodic sweeps that everyone learned to predict and avoid, slaves being transported in chains toward the auction house that loomed over everything like a monument to humanity's capacity for cruelty. He'd see them sometimes, during his walks back to the boarding house. Collared figures with dead eyes, moving with the mechanical precision of people who'd learned that hope was more dangerous than despair. Something would twist in his chest each time, a combination of rage and helplessness that made his amplified ki surge in ways Rayleigh's training hadn't yet taught him to control. He'd have to duck into alleys, press his forehead against cool stone, and force himself to breathe through the urge to simply tear the auction house apart brick by brick. Not yet, he'd tell himself, repeating Rayleigh's advice like a mantra. Power without preparation is just making yourself feel better while accomplishing nothing. Wait. Learn. Then act. But waiting felt like complicity, and the weight of that moral calculus pressed down on him during the quiet hours when training couldn't distract from the larger questions he'd been avoiding. What did it mean that he had power here, in a world that seemed designed to punish the powerless? What was his responsibility to a society that wasn't his own, that he'd never chosen to be part of? And how did he reconcile the scholar who believed in systems and institutions with the warrior who'd learned that sometimes justice required breaking things that couldn't be reformed? It was during the third week that Rayleigh introduced him to the concept of Conqueror's Haki in practice rather than theory. They'd been sparring. Gohan was actually holding his own now, his observation sharp enough to read most of Rayleigh's attacks, his armament stable enough to withstand the ones he couldn't dodge, when the older man suddenly stopped mid-strike. His expression shifted into something contemplative and slightly dangerous, and before Gohan could ask what had changed, the air itself seemed to become heavy. Pressure descended like a physical weight, pressing down on Gohan's shoulders, his chest, his very consciousness. It wasn't attacking him, wasn't even hostile exactly, but it carried an overwhelming sense of presence, as though Rayleigh's will had expanded to fill the entire clearing and was now examining Gohan like a specimen under glass. The sensation was distantly familiar, reminded him of standing before Beerus when the god of destruction had first arrived on Earth, that same impression of facing something so fundamentally beyond your weight class that resistance felt absurd. But where Beerus's presence had been alien and absolute, Rayleigh's felt almost conversational. It pressed against Gohan's consciousness with a question that didn't need words. Who are you? What do you want? Why should reality care about your intentions? Gohan's hybrid aura flared an instinctive response, his amplified ki surging to meet the pressure with its own assertion of existence. For a moment the two forces contested the space between them, Rayleigh's Conqueror's Haki and Gohan's amplified energy, either quite overpowering the other, just existing in uncomfortable proximity like two territorial animals assessing whether conflict was necessary. Then Rayleigh withdrew his presence, and the pressure lifted so abruptly that Gohan staggered, gasping for breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His heart hammered against his ribs with the frantic rhythm of someone who just survived something they hadn't quite understood. Interesting, Rayleigh murmured, his tone carrying that particular quality of academic fascination that made Gohan's scholar instincts prick up despite his disorientation. Your energy responded to my Conqueror's Haki like it recognized a threat to your existence. Not a physical threat, an existential one. As though my will was challenging your right to be here, and your ki answered by asserting that right. What? Gohan forced his breathing to steady, forced his racing thoughts into something approaching coherence. What was that? Conqueror's Haki at its most basic level, Rayleigh explained, though his eyes remained sharp, analytical, still studying the way Gohan's aura continued to pulse with defensive patterns. The manifestation of kingly ambition, the ability to impose your will upon reality itself and have reality acknowledge that imposition. Most people's spirits simply break under that pressure. They faint, lose consciousness, because their sense of self can't withstand being challenged so fundamentally. But you. He gestured to where Gohan's hybrid aura still flickered with gold and black. You didn't break. Your energy rose to meet mine, as though it couldn't conceive of simply submitting. The observation sat uncomfortably in Gohan's mind, because it implied things about his nature that he'd spent years trying to deny. He'd always thought of himself as someone who could submit when necessary, who understood hierarchy and respected authority. But Rayleigh was suggesting that on some fundamental level, deeper than conscious thought, rooted in whatever made his ki respond before his mind could intervene, he couldn't tolerate having his existence questioned. Does that mean I have Conqueror's Haki? The question came out more uncertain than he'd intended. Rayleigh tilted his head, considering. You have the raw material for it. That's clear from how your energy responded. Whether you can actually manifest it yourself depends on whether you can articulate what you want to impose upon the world. Conquerors isn't just about refusing to submit. It's about having a vision clear enough and conviction strong enough that reality itself bends to acknowledge it. He paused, studying Gohan with those ancient, knowing eyes. So tell me, Son D. Gohan, what do you want? Not what you think you should want, not what would make you a good person or fulfill others' expectations. What do you actually want? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that made Gohan's chest tighten with something approaching panic. Because he didn't have a good answer. His entire life had been defined by reacting to threats, by being what others needed him to be, Earth's protector, his mother's son, Vidal's husband, Pan's father. He'd never stopped long enough to ask what he wanted, separate from all those roles and responsibilities. Or maybe he had asked, and the answer had terrified him too much to acknowledge. I don't know, he admitted finally, the honesty feeling like defeat. I want my family safe. I want to go home. I want. He trailed off, because the rest of the thought refused to articulate itself properly. I want to not be responsible for everyone's survival. I want someone else to be the hero for once. I want permission to be selfish without the weight of worlds hanging on my choices. But saying those things aloud would mean admitting he'd been running from heroism rather than toward it, that his displacement to this world might be less tragedy and more subconscious escape. And he wasn't quite ready to face that truth, not when Rayleigh was looking at him with an expression that suggested the older man already knew. Then you're not ready for Conqueror's hockey, Rayleigh said simply, without judgment, just stating fact. And that's fine. Most people never develop it, and they live perfectly meaningful lives regardless. But I needed you to understand what it would require. Needed you to feel that pressure and recognize whether you had the capacity to generate it yourself. Now you know. He gestured for them to resume sparring positions. We'll continue focusing on observation and armament. Those are more immediately useful anyway, and they don't require you to have your existential crisis fully resolved. The training continued, but something had shifted in Gohan's understanding. He'd felt Rayleigh's Conqueror's hockey, had felt his own energy rise to meet it, and in that moment of contested presence he'd glimpsed what it meant to impose your will upon reality with such conviction that reality had no choice but to acknowledge you. It was both intoxicating and terrifying. The idea that power could be more than physical force, that consciousness itself could become a weapon if wielded with sufficient certainty. But certainty was exactly what he lacked. His life had been a series of conflicts between what he wanted and what others needed from him, and he never quite figured out how to resolve that tension. Even now, in this foreign world with his family impossibly far away, he found himself unable to simply choose selfishness or selflessness, instead hovering in that uncomfortable middle ground where every choice felt like betraying something important. The turning point came during the fourth week, though Gohan wouldn't recognize it as such until much later. He'd been walking through Grove 1, the heart of the lawless zone, where pirates gathered to drink and brawl and trade stories of violence that made the listeners either envious or nauseated depending on their constitution. It was stupid to be there, really. Rayleigh had warned him that the lawless groves drew attention like blood drew sharks, that someone with Gohan's presence would inevitably attract challenges from pirates looking to prove themselves. But Gohan had been restless, his skin crawling with the particular agitation that came from too much internal conflict and not enough external outlet. Training with Rayleigh was productive but controlled, never quite reaching the intensity that would let him stop thinking entirely. And the boarding house felt too quiet, too much like the life he'd been trying to build back home, peaceful, domestic, safe. Everything he'd claimed to want but which now felt like a cage. So he'd walked into the lawless zone with the half-conscious hope that something would happen, that someone would give him an excuse to stop being careful. The excuse arrived in the form of 4 pirates, drunk enough to be confident, sober enough to be dangerous, who'd decided that the quiet young man in simple clothes would make easy prey. They'd surrounded him in an alley, their leader, a man with a scarred face and a cutlass that had clearly seen use, leering with the particular expression of someone who enjoyed having power over others. "Nice coat," the leader said, gesturing to the simple garment Tomo had given Gohan. "I'll take that. And whatever coin you're carrying. Call it a toll for walking through our territory." Gohan should have de-escalated. Should have used words to defuse the situation, or simply paid the toll and walked away. It wasn't about the coat or the money, he barely had either. It was about not drawing attention, about maintaining the low profile Rayleigh had advised until his training was complete. But something in the leader's leer, that casual assumption of dominance, that certainty that he could take whatever he wanted simply because he was willing to use violence, made something cold and furious settle in Gohan's chest. He thought of the collared slaves he'd seen, of the auction house looming over everything, of a world that seemed designed to reward cruelty and punish weakness. And he thought about how he'd been carefully controlling himself for weeks, suppressing his power, pretending to be less than he was because Rayleigh had said it was strategic. His hybrid aura flickered to life before he could consciously decide to release it, just a pulse, barely visible, but carrying enough presence that all 4 pirates took an involuntary step back. "No," Gohan said quietly, and his voice carried a quality he never quite heard in it before. Flat, absolute, allowing for no negotiation or compromise. "You're going to leave. Now." And you're going to think very carefully about whether extorting people is really how you want to spend your remaining time on this archipelago. The leader's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, anger, calculation, before settling on something that looked like wounded pride. Do you have any idea who you're talking to? I'm Captain Vex of the Bleeding Cutlass crew. We've got a bounty of 8 million berries. And you're just some nobody who... Gohan moved. He didn't think about it, didn't plan the technique, or calculate the force required. His body just responded to the threat assessment his observation haki had been conducting in the background. For opponents, all weaker than him by orders of magnitude, none of them presenting actual danger. His armament-coated fist caught Captain Vex in the solar plexus with precisely calibrated force. Enough to incapacitate without killing, enough to send a message without permanent damage. The pirate captain folded like a puppet with cut strings, the air driven from his lungs in a wheeze that carried notes of genuine shock. His 3 companions stared for a frozen moment, their brains struggling to process what they'd just witnessed, before their survival instincts finally kicked in and they scattered like startled birds. Gohan stood over the gasping captain, his hybrid aura still flickering with that cold fury that refused to dissipate despite the threat being neutralized. And in that moment, with his power uncaged and his control held by the thinnest margin, he understood with uncomfortable clarity what Rayleigh had been trying to tell him about Conqueror's haki. This was what he wanted. Not the violence itself, but the certainty. The ability to draw a line and say this far and no further without having to justify or explain or compromise. For his entire life, he'd been negotiating with threats, trying to find peaceful solutions, holding back because killing or permanent harm felt like failure. But standing here, watching a would-be extortionist struggle to breathe, Gohan felt no guilt. Just a cold satisfaction that justice, however rough, had been served. And that realization terrified him more than any enemy ever had. "What have you done?" The voice came from behind him, sharp, feminine, carrying authority that made Gohan's newly developed observation haki ping with recognition of significant power. He turned to find a woman standing at the alley's entrance, her marine captain's coat billowing dramatically despite the lack of wind. She was young, maybe early 20s, with short dark hair and eyes that assessed him with the same analytical precision he recognized in his own mirror. "This man attempted to extort me," Gohan explained, keeping his voice level despite the adrenaline still singing through his system. "I defended myself." "Defended yourself," the marine captain repeated, her tone suggesting she found his word choice amusing. "By using what appears to be a unique variant of armament haki to incapacitate a pirate with a single blow. Defended yourself by releasing an aura that I felt from 3 groves away, an aura that reads as neither haki nor standard devil fruit power, but something unprecedented." She took a step closer, her hand resting casually on the sword at her hip. "I'm Captain Isana of Marine Intelligence. And you, stranger, have just made yourself very interesting to people who prefer their islands orderly, and their power users catalogued." Gohan felt his heart sink even as his mind spun through tactical calculations. This was what Rayleigh had warned him about: attention from the world government, recognition that he represented something they couldn't predict or control. He'd been in this world for less than 2 months and he'd already painted a target on himself because he couldn't tolerate a small-time pirate's petty cruelty. Stupid. Careless. Exactly what Piccolo always warned you about, letting emotion override strategy. But even as the self-recrimination cycled through his thoughts, another part of him, the part that had enjoyed the certainty, the cold satisfaction of drawing that line, didn't regret it. Captain Vex would think twice before extorting civilians again. And if that attention from Marines was the cost of demonstrating that cruelty wouldn't go unchallenged, then maybe it was a cost worth paying. "I'm not looking for trouble," Gohan said carefully, releasing his armament coating, letting his aura settle back beneath his skin. "I'm just trying to exist here peacefully, but I won't tolerate being victimized, and I won't stand by while others are victimized in front of me." Captain Isana's expression shifted into something that might have been respect or might have been concern. Noble sentiments. Dangerous sentiments, in a world where power attracts the wrong kind of attention. "Tell me," her eyes narrowed, studying him with renewed focus. "Have you heard of the human auction house in Grove 1? The one that sells slaves to celestial dragons and wealthy nobles?" The question felt like a test, and Gohan answered with absolute honesty, Yes. I've seen the slaves being transported. It's an abomination. And if you had the power to stop it? Isana pressed. If you could walk into that auction house and free everyone inside, consequences be damned, would you? It was definitely a test. Answering yes would mark him as a revolutionary, someone who opposed the world government's institutions openly. Answering no would be lying, and his amplified ki was already beginning to pulse with the emotional response to imagining that scenario. Yes, Gohan said simply, because anything else would be dishonest. Without hesitation, Captain Isana studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she did something unexpected. She smiled, and it carried genuine warmth rather than the predatory satisfaction he'd been expecting. Good answer, she said quietly. Wrong answer if you want to survive in this world, but good nonetheless. Most people, even good people, would hedge, would talk about systems and procedures and why violence isn't the answer. But you just said yes, as though the choice was obvious. She glanced down at Captain Vex, who was still struggling to regain his breath. I'm going to pretend I didn't see this. And I'm going to pretend we never had this conversation. But understand something, stranger, I'm Marine intelligence. My job is to identify threats to order and stability. And what you represent, that's going to draw attention you're not prepared to handle. She turned to leave, then paused at the alley's entrance, looking back with an expression that mixed warning and something that might have been sympathy. The auction is in 2 days. If you're planning to do something catastrophically stupid, at least wait until Marine presence is minimal. Dawn shifts change at 6. There's usually a 30-minute window where coverage is lightest. Not that I'm suggesting anything, of course. Then she was gone, leaving Gohan alone with an incapacitated pirate, and the sinking realization that he'd just been given tactical intelligence by a Marine captain who theoretically should have arrested him. The world was more complicated than he'd understood, he realized. Not a simple binary of good and evil, but a complex web of people making compromises and calculating costs, and occasionally bending rules because their conscience demanded it. He looked down at his hands, coated in that golden black armament just moments ago, now just ordinary flesh, and felt the weight of Rayleigh's question settling over him again. What do you want? The answer was starting to crystallize, sharp and uncomfortable and undeniable. He wanted to not have to choose between being safe and being good. He wanted a world where cruelty had consequences and power came with obligations rather than privileges. He wanted to stop negotiating with his own conscience about when violence was justified and when it was just satisfying his own rage. But most of all, and this was the truth he'd been avoiding since arriving in this world, he wanted permission to be the person his power suggested he should be. Not the scholar his mother had dreamed of, not the peaceful husband Vidal had hoped for, but the warrior who drew lines in the sand and dared reality to challenge them. Gohan left the alley as Captain Vex finally managed to sit up, gasping and confused. He walked back toward the boarding house with his mind already turning over tactical problems. The auction house's layout, guard rotations, probable number of slaves, escape routes, contingencies for if things went wrong. He would train with Rayleigh tomorrow morning, just like always. Would continue refining his observation and armament hockey. Would practice controlling his amplified ki until it responded with the precision of a scalpel rather than the chaos of a hammer. But in 2 days, at dawn, when Marine presence was lightest and the auction house was preparing for its grotesque spectacle, Gohan was going to do something catastrophically stupid, and for the first time since arriving in this world, the prospect of violence didn't fill him with guilt or fear. It filled him with cold, crystalline certainty. The night before the auction, Gohan found himself unable to sleep. He lay in the narrow bed of Tomo's boarding house, staring at the ceiling where moonlight filtered through gaps in the wooden shutters, painting silver patterns that shifted with the movement of clouds he couldn't see. His amplified ki hummed beneath his skin with restless energy, responding to the anticipation coiling in his chest, that peculiar combination of dread and eagerness that preceded violence he'd chosen rather than violence that had chosen him. Tomorrow morning, at dawn, he would become something he'd spent years trying not to be, not a defender responding to immediate threat, not a protector acting out of necessity, but an aggressor who'd decided that a system needed breaking and appointed himself the instrument of that destruction. The distinction mattered, even if no one else would see it that way. It was the difference between reactive and proactive violence, between defense and declaration, and the weight of that choice pressed down on him with the same inexorable patience as this world's strange sky. He'd spent the evening memorizing the auction house's layout, information gleaned from careful observation over the past days, supplemented by casual questions to merchants who frequented Grove 1. The building was 3 stories, reinforced stone construction that spoke of permanence and institutional confidence. Guards rotated in 6-hour shifts, their patterns predictable to anyone patient enough to watch. The slaves were kept in holding cells beneath the main floor, accessible through a single reinforced door that was never left unguarded. The tactical problems were straightforward enough. Get inside during the shift change when coverage was thinnest. Neutralize guards quickly and quietly before they could raise alarm. Free the slaves and provide them enough of a head start to reach the lawless groves where marine jurisdiction became negotiable. Then disappear before overwhelming force arrived to restore order. Simple in theory, catastrophically complicated in practice. Because the real problem wasn't the guards or the building's defenses. Gohan's amplified ki gave him advantages that made conventional security almost laughable. The real problem was what came after. The world government didn't tolerate challenges to its institutions, and attacking an auction house that catered to celestial dragons would mark him as something far more dangerous than a random pirate. It would make him a revolutionary, whether he wanted that label or not. And maybe that's what this world needs, whispered a voice in his mind that sounded disturbingly like his father's. Someone willing to break things that can't be fixed by working within the system. But another voice, Piccolo's, carrying that particular gruffness that masked concern, countered, breaking things is easy. Building something better is what separates heroes from vandals. What happens to those slaves after you free them? Where do they go in a world designed to recapture them? Gohan turned onto his side, drawing his knees up slightly, feeling the cool sheets against skin that always ran warmer than it should. These were the questions he'd been avoiding, the practical considerations that complicated the moral clarity he'd been clinging to. Freeing slaves felt righteous, inarguable, but freedom without infrastructure to support it, without safe harbor, without resources, without some vision of what came next, was just a different kind of cruelty. Yet waiting for perfect conditions, for comprehensive solutions, meant watching the auction proceed tomorrow as it had countless times before. Meant accepting that his comfort with ambiguity mattered more than their suffering mattered. And that was a calculus he couldn't make peace with, no matter how many tactical considerations he stacked against it. His amplified ki pulsed in agreement, responding to the emotional conviction crystallizing in his chest, and for once Gohan didn't fight it. He'd spent weeks learning to control this power, to suppress it, to make it behave according to frameworks imported from a world that no longer applied. But perhaps control didn't mean suppression. Perhaps it meant integration, accepting that his energy would amplify his convictions, and choosing those convictions carefully enough that amplification served purpose rather than just venting emotion. The moonlight shifted as clouds moved overhead, and in the changing patterns Gohan thought he saw faces. Videl, disappointed but unsurprised that he'd chosen violence again. His mother, terrified that her son was becoming the monster she'd always feared. Pan, too young to understand why her father had abandoned her but old enough to feel the absence like a wound that wouldn't heal. And his father, God, his father would have loved this. Would have walked into that auction house with a grin and absolute certainty that breaking chains was its own justification. Goku had never agonized over moral complexity, never spent sleepless nights calculating costs and consequences. He just acted, trusting that his intentions were pure and his strength was sufficient. And somehow that naive certainty had saved the world more times than Gohan could count. But Gohan wasn't Goku. Had never been Goku, despite everyone's expectations. He carried too much of his mother's analytical caution, too much awareness of how easily good intentions could produce catastrophic outcomes. The Cell Games had taught him that lesson with brutal clarity. His mercy toward a beaten enemy had cost his father's life, had nearly destroyed the Earth. And he'd never quite forgiven himself for that hesitation, for that moment of letting moral consideration override tactical necessity. So which is this? He wondered, staring at the ceiling's silver patterns. Am I hesitating out of tactical wisdom, or am I just finding excuses to avoid the guilt that comes with choosing violence? The question had no easy answer, which was probably the point. Easy answers were for people like his father, who could afford to be simple because their strength made consequences negotiable. But Gohan had learned, was still learning, that complexity wasn't cowardice. Sometimes the hardest thing was acting despite understanding all the ways it could go wrong. He thought of Captain Isana, of her warning that had simultaneously been tactical intelligence. A Marine captain who looked at him and seen something worth protecting, even if protecting it meant bending the rules she'd sworn to uphold. What did it mean that this world produced people who understood that systems sometimes needed breaking from within, even as they continued serving those systems? It means nothing is simple, Piccolo's imagined voice supplied. And anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or hasn't thought it through. Gohan finally abandoned the pretense of sleep sometime past midnight. He rose, dressed in the simple dark clothes he'd acquired for tomorrow's work, and moved through the boarding house with the careful silence of someone who'd learned to be invisible when necessary. The streets of Sabaody were never truly empty. The lawless groves operated on their own circadian rhythms, chaos and commerce continuing regardless of day or night. But this late the crowds thinned enough that movement became easier. He found himself walking toward the library in Grove 41, drawn by instincts he didn't quite understand but had learned not to ignore. The building was closed at this hour, dark and silent, but Gohan's observation Haki detected a single presence inside, someone still awake, still working despite the late hour. He recognized the signature before he saw her, the scholar he'd met weeks ago, the woman who'd corrected his name to Sun D. Gohan with casual certainty that had suggested knowledge she shouldn't possess. The door was locked, but locks were suggestions to someone who could control their key with precision. Gohan gathered a thin thread of energy, shaped it into something that could interface with the mechanism's internal components, and felt the tumblers shift with satisfying clicks. He slipped inside, closing the door behind him with the same careful silence, and followed the presence deeper into the building. He found her in the archives, a room lined floor to ceiling with books and scrolls and documents that smelled of old paper and older secrets. She was bent over a table covered in texts, her dark hair pulled back in a style that suggested it had been neat hours ago, but had gradually succumbed to distraction. When Gohan's footsteps announced his presence, she looked up without apparent surprise, as though she'd been expecting him. Sun D. Gohan, she said, and her tone carried that same quality of recognition that had unsettled him during their first meeting. I wondered when you'd come asking questions. The lost boy who carries a letter he doesn't understand, who moves like gravity is optional, who looks at our world with the confusion of someone who's seen better alternatives. She gestured to the chair across from her, an invitation rather than a command. Sit. Let's talk about what the D means, and why it matters that you carry it despite being from somewhere else entirely. Gohan sat, feeling his amplified ki settle into attentive readiness, not hostile, but aware that this conversation might reshape things he thought he understood. Up close, the scholar was younger than he'd initially assessed, probably only a few years older than him, but her eyes carried the particular weariness that came from pursuing knowledge that powerful people preferred remain buried. My name is Nico Robin, she introduced herself formally, though something in her expression suggested the name should mean something to him. When his blank look made clear it didn't, she smiled, sad and knowing. Of course you wouldn't know. You're not from here, not truly. But the world government knows my name very well. I'm the last person alive who can read the poneglyphs, the ancient texts that contain the true history they've spent 800 years trying to erase. The weight of that statement settled over Gohan like a shroud. He thought of Bulma, of all the times she'd railed against institutions that tried to suppress scientific knowledge out of fear or control. Thought of Namek's history being passed down through oral tradition because their planet's destruction had nearly erased their cultural memory. Knowledge suppression was universal, apparently, a constant across dimensions, something powerful people did when truth threatened their legitimacy. The D. Robin continued, pulling one of the texts closer and turning it so Gohan could see the ancient script, appears throughout the lost history. We call them the D clan, though that's probably inaccurate, more metaphor than lineage. They're not related by blood so much as by a shared quality. The texts describe them as the natural enemies of the gods, as inheritors of an ancient will that opposes tyranny in all its forms. Her finger traced symbols Gohan couldn't read but which seemed to pulse with significance nonetheless. Every person who carries the D has this in common: they refuse to accept the world as it is. They look at systems built on suffering and feel compelled to break them, regardless of personal cost. Gohan felt something cold settle in his chest, because that description was uncomfortably accurate. He'd never been able to accept suffering as inevitable, never been able to look at injustice and simply move past it. Even when he tried to build a peaceful life, even when he desperately wanted to be normal, that core inability to tolerate cruelty had always drawn him back into violence. "But I'm not from this world," he protested weakly. "How can I carry a letter that's part of your history?" Robin's smile was enigmatic, carrying knowledge she was choosing not to share fully. "Perhaps the D is less about history and more about nature. Perhaps whatever brought you to our world recognized that quality in you and marked you accordingly. Or perhaps," she leaned back, studying him with those ancient young eyes, "the will that the D represents exists across all worlds, all dimensions, and you've always carried it. You just didn't have a name for it until you came here." The possibility resonated with uncomfortable accuracy. Gohan thought of every time he'd chosen to fight when walking away was possible, every moment he'd prioritized others' safety over his own peace, every instance where his inability to tolerate injustice had overridden his desire for a quiet life. Maybe that had always been the will of D, expressing itself in a universe that didn't have the vocabulary to name it. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked finally. "Why risk meeting with someone the world government will mark as dangerous after tomorrow?" Because Robin clearly knew what he was planning. The text spread across her table included maps of Grove 1, documents detailing auction house operations, records of previous attacks on world government institutions. She'd been researching the same thing he had, just from a different angle. "Because I've been running for 20 years, Robin said quietly, and the weariness in her voice spoke of exhaustion that went bone deep. "Running from Marines who want me dead because I can read history they've tried to erase. Running from bounty hunters who see me as 8 digits worth of profit. Running from my own shadow because standing still means dying." She met his eyes, and something in her gaze made Gohan's breath catch. "And I'm tired. Tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of watching the world burn because people like me, people who know the truth, are too afraid to act on that knowledge. So you want me to do what you can't?" There was no accusation in his tone, just understanding. "Break something publicly while you continue gathering information quietly?" "I want you to remember," Robin corrected, "that every system of oppression depends on people believing it's too big to break. The world government has ruled for 800 years not because they're invincible, but because they've convinced everyone that resistance is futile. One person attacking an auction house won't end slavery, but it will prove that the system isn't as solid as they claim. It will plant a seed that grows into revolution, eventually." She stood then, gathering the documents into a neat pile and sliding them across the table to Gohan. Auction house blueprints, guard rotations, safe routes through the lawless groves, contacts who could provide shelter to escaped slaves. Everything he'd been trying to piece together from observation, compiled with the precision of someone who'd made preparation into an art form. "I can't give you much," Robin said. "But I can give you information, and I can tell you that you're not the first to carry the D, who looked at this world and felt compelled to break it." GOLD. Roger stood on an execution platform and turned his death into the catalyst for an age of dreams. Monkey D. Luffy, just a boy now but carrying that same will someday challenge the entire structure of power and probably win. And you, she placed one hand on his shoulder, and the gesture carried surprising weight. "You're part of that lineage now, whether you chose it or not. The question is whether you'll run from it like I did, or embrace it and accept the consequences." Gohan looked down at the documents, at the careful handwriting detailing everything he needed to know, and felt that cold certainty crystallize into something approaching purpose. Robin was right. This wouldn't end slavery, wouldn't topple the world government, wouldn't fix everything broken about this world. But it would be a statement, clear and unambiguous, that someone was willing to challenge the system regardless of personal cost. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what the will of D meant, not the power to fix everything, but the refusal to accept that nothing could be fixed. "Thank you," he said quietly, gathering the documents with careful hands. "For the information. For the context. For..." He paused, searching for words adequate to the moment. "For reminding me that knowledge and action aren't opposed to each other. That I don't have to choose between being a scholar and being a warrior. Robin's smile was sad and knowing. You never did, Gohan? That was always a false dichotomy. Scholars who refuse to act on their knowledge are just decorative. Warriors who don't think about why they're fighting are just destructive. But someone who studies the world's problems and breaks the systems perpetuating them? She squeezed his shoulder once before releasing it. That's someone who might actually change things. He left the library as quietly as he'd entered, the documents tucked carefully inside his coat. His mind spinning with implications he need time to fully process. The sky was beginning to lighten, not quite dawn, but close enough that the stars were fading into pale gray. In an hour, maybe less, the shift change at the auction house would create that 30-minute window Captain Isana had mentioned. Gohan made his way back to the boarding house, not to sleep but to prepare. He changed into clothes that would allow free movement, dark, nondescript, chosen for function rather than fashion. He secured Robin's documents in a waterproof case and hid them beneath loose floorboards in his room, insurance against if things went catastrophically wrong. He stood before the small mirror Tomo had provided and studied his reflection with the analytical distance of someone assessing a stranger. His eyes held that new intensity, sharper somehow, as though seeing through the lens of observation hockey had altered something fundamental about his gaze. His body carried lean muscle built through weeks of Rayleigh's brutal training, different from the bulk he'd maintained back home but somehow more efficient. And when he summoned his ki experimentally, just a flicker, nothing more, it responded with that golden-black pattern that marked him as changed, as other, as something this world had no framework for categorizing. This is who you are now, he thought, meeting his own eyes in the glass. Not the scholar who wanted peace. Not the warrior everyone expected. Something in between, something new. Can you live with that? The answer, when it came, surprised him with its simplicity, yes. Because standing in that boarding house room, watching the sky lighten beyond his window, Gohan finally understood what had been missing from his life in the other universe. It wasn't power. He'd always had more than enough of that. It wasn't purpose. Protecting Earth had given him that, whether he'd wanted it or not. What had been missing was permission. Permission to be complicated, to embrace contradictions, to stop apologizing for the fact that he was good at violence, and sometimes, in the right circumstances, enjoyed it. This world, harsh and cruel and broken in ways that demanded breaking things to fix them, had given him that permission. And whether he'd been pulled here by accident or design, whether the will of D was destiny or just convenient explanation, didn't matter as much as what he chose to do with the opportunity. Gohan left the boarding house for the last time as the sun crested the horizon, painting Sabedi Archipelago in shades of gold that turned the bubble-coated trees into something almost beautiful. He moved through the groves with purposeful silence, his observation hockey extended, reading the emotional currents of everyone he passed. Fear, exhaustion, hope, despair. The full spectrum of human experience compressed into this strange archipelago where bubbles defied physics and slavery was just another business. Grove 1 was quiet at this hour, the pirates and criminals who usually dominated it sleeping off the excesses of the previous night. The auction house loomed ahead, 3 stories of stone and institutional confidence, windows dark, guards at their posts but showing the telltale signs of shift and fatigue. Gohan found a vantage point on a neighboring building's roof and settled in to wait, his amplified ki held beneath his skin like a coiled spring. His mind going through final tactical calculations with the precision Piccolo had beaten into him across a childhood of brutal training. The shift change began at precisely 6 o'clock. Guards filed out of the building in groups, replaced by fresh troops whose alertness hadn't yet been worn down by hours of boring patrol. For 30 minutes, the transition created gaps in coverage, not dramatic ones, but enough. Enough for someone who could move with Saiyan speed and observation hockey precision to slip past without raising immediate alarm. Gohan waited until the gap was widest, 23 minutes into the shift change, when half the old guards had left but some of the new ones were still receiving briefings inside. Then he moved. His armament-coated body dropped from the roof in absolute silence, landing in the alley beside the auction house with impact that should have been catastrophic but which his controlled ki absorbed and dispersed harmlessly. He found the side entrance Robin's documents had detailed. A service door used by staff, secured but not reinforced. His key-shaped lockpicks made quick work of the mechanism, and then he was inside, moving through maintenance corridors lit by dim emergency lights that cast everything in shades of amber and shadow. The cells were exactly where Robin had said they'd be, beneath the main floor, accessible through a reinforced door that was, as predicted, never left unguarded. Gohan's observation haki painted the scene before he rounded the corner. 2 guards, alert but bored, their attention focused more on their conversation than their surroundings. Neither of them radiated significant power. Neither of them would see him coming. He moved with clinical efficiency, his armament-coated hands striking pressure points with precisely calculated force. Both guards crumpled without sound, unconscious before their brains could register the attack. Gohan caught them before they fell, lowering their bodies gently, no need for unnecessary harm, and appropriated the key ring from the first guard's belt. The door opened onto a stairwell that descended into darkness broken only by occasional torches. Gohan moved down the steps with controlled speed, his observation haki extended, counting presences below. 17 distinct signatures, all of them carrying the particular emotional resonance of people who'd given up hoping for rescue. And beneath that resignation, layers of fear and anger and grief that made his amplified ki surge in sympathetic response to suffering he couldn't ignore. The holding cells were as brutal as he'd anticipated. Cramped cages barely large enough to stand in, no sanitation, no privacy, just raw institutional cruelty designed to break spirits before the auction even began. The slaves looked up as he appeared. Men, women, children, all of them carrying collars that would apparently explode if removed incorrectly. All of them seeing just another captor until Gohan raised his hands in a gesture of peace and spoke with quiet intensity that carried to every cell. I'm here to free you. Not as a savior, not as a hero. Just as someone who looked at this system and decided it needed breaking. He summoned his ki, letting it flare just enough that they could see the golden black aura, letting them understand that he had power sufficient to make good on that promise. The collars, I'm told they're rigged to explode. Does anyone know how to disable them safely? Silence greeted his question, broken finally by a voice from the back. A man, middle-aged, carrying the particular confidence that suggested technical knowledge. The keys are upstairs in the overseer's office. 3 different locks per collar, all requiring simultaneous activation. Without the keys, removal triggers the explosives. Gohan nodded, mind already adjusting the plan. Then we go get the keys. Where exactly is this office? The man directed him. 2nd floor, eastern corner, guarded by at least 4 people at all times. The tactical problem was straightforward. Neutralize 4 guards quietly enough to avoid raising general alarm, acquire the keys, return to free the slaves, then extract everyone through routes Robin had identified as leading to safe houses in the lawless groves. Simple in theory, complicated by the fact that time was now a factor. The longer he spent here, the higher the probability someone would discover the unconscious guards and trigger lockdown. Stay quiet, Gohan instructed, already moving back toward the stairs. I'll return with the keys within 10 minutes. If I'm not back by then, assume something went wrong and prepare to defend yourselves with whatever you can improvise. He didn't wait for acknowledgement, just moved, back up the stairs, through the corridors, his observation haki mapping the building's layout in real time. The overseer's office radiated 4 distinct presences, exactly as described, their emotional signatures suggesting alertness but not alarm. They didn't know yet that anything was wrong, which meant Gohan still had the element of surprise. What followed was violence stripped of ceremony or flourish, just brutal efficiency honed by years of combat and weeks of Rayleigh's training. Gohan moved through the office like a ghost made solid only at the moment of impact, his armament-coated strikes dropping guards before they could draw weapons or raise alarm. Within 30 seconds all 4 were unconscious, arranged carefully so they wouldn't suffocate or choke, and Gohan was rifling through the desk drawers looking for collar keys. He found them in a locked cabinet, 17 sets, each one labeled with a number corresponding to a specific slave. The casual organization of it, the bureaucratic efficiency applied to human ownership, made something cold and furious settle in his chest. But he channeled that fury into movement, gathering the keys and returning to the cells with speed that pushed the boundaries of what even his enhanced body could safely achieve. The freeing process was methodical and agonizing. Each collar required 3 simultaneous key turns in specific sequences, and rushing risked triggering the explosives. Gohan worked through them systematically, his hands steady despite the adrenaline singing through his system, his observation haki monitoring the building above for any sign that his intrusion had been detected. 17 collars. 17 lives reclaimed from a system that had reduced them to property. And with each one that clicked open and fell away, Gohan felt his amplified ki pulse with something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been the beginning of addiction to this feeling, the certainty that came from drawing lines and enforcing them through force. Go, he told them once the last collar had been removed. The routes on this map. He produced Robin's documents, showing them the marked paths through the lawless groves. Lead to safe houses that will provide shelter until you can get off the archipelago. Move in small groups, stay quiet, and understand that your freedom will last exactly as long as you're smart about maintaining it. They moved with the desperate efficiency of people who understood this might be their only chance, filing up the stairs in silence broken only by whispered gratitude that Gohan waved away. He wasn't looking for thanks. Wasn't looking for recognition or redemption or any of the things heroes were supposed to want from their heroism. He'd broken something that needed breaking, and that was its own justification. But as the last of them disappeared into the pre-dawn streets, as Gohan prepared to follow and ensure they reached safety, his observation haki screamed a warning that came a fraction of a second too late. The presence that descended upon the auction house carried such overwhelming power that it made Gohan's amplified ki recoil in instinctive recognition of a predator far up the food chain. He spun, his armament coating his body before conscious thought could catch up to instinct, and found himself facing something that shouldn't exist outside nightmares. The man, if he could be called that, wore a white suit pristine enough to hurt the eyes and a helmet made of glass or crystal that obscured his face completely. But it was his presence that made Gohan's breath catch, not his appearance. This was power of a completely different quality than anything he'd encountered in this world so far. Not ki, not haki, but something else. Something that carried the weight of institutionalized cruelty given form and permission to act without constraint. A celestial dragon, someone whispered behind him, one of the freed slaves who lingered, frozen by terror that apparently transcended even the survival instinct. Oh God, we're all dead. And Gohan, standing between 17 freed slaves and a power that radiated the casual certainty of someone who'd never been challenged, realized with sinking clarity that this rescue had just become something far more complicated than he'd planned for. The celestial dragon raised one gloved hand, pointing at Gohan with the same casual indifference someone might show toward an insect, and spoke with a voice that carried absolute entitlement. You slave, kneel. Gohan's amplified ki exploded outward in response, not as attack, not yet, but as pure refusal, as the fundamental impossibility of submitting to someone whose entire existence was predicated on the suffering of others. And in that moment of contested presence, of a meeting will in the space between violence and negotiation, Gohan finally understood what Rayleigh had been trying to teach him about Conqueror's haki. It wasn't about wanting to rule. It was about being constitutionally incapable of accepting subjugation. His aura, golden and black, pulsing with amplified conviction, crashed against the celestial dragon's expectation like waves against stone. And for the first time since arriving in this world, Gohan stopped running from what his power made him, stopped apologizing for the monster everyone had always feared he'd become, and let that cold certainty crystallize into words that would reshape everything he thought he understood about who he was capable of being. No. The single syllable carried the weight of absolute conviction, and the air itself seemed to crack with the force of will refusing to bend. Somewhere in the building above them, glass windows shattered. Somewhere in the streets beyond, people who never met Gohan felt the pressure and collapsed, their consciousness unable to withstand the assertion of presence that brooked no negotiation. And in that moment, standing in an auction house basement with freed slaves behind him and a celestial dragon before him, his power finally unchained from the careful control that had defined his entire life. Sunday. Gohan finally found the answer to the question that had haunted him since arriving in this world. He didn't want to rule. Didn't want recognition or glory or any of the things warriors were supposed to crave. He just wanted the absolute certainty that came from drawing a line and daring reality to challenge it. And apparently, that was enough.